Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
I'm your other co-host, Dean Detlef.
Folks, you may recall that in previous weeks, as we've been discussing degrowth and socialism and economics, we made a big claim. And the claim is this, that sometimes people will make a criticism of degrowth and say it's ascetic, it's monastic. And they use that phrase monastic as a way to to slander the good name of degrowth socialism in the world. But to us, hey, wait, that sounds kind of cool. I've been to a monastery before, and actually, it's rad. In a previous episode, we were kind of thinking about the ways that monastic life actually kind of affords you all of these types of community life and support, a type of thick community that can handle sort of dealing with tough situations in ways that sort of the atomized capitalist world that we do live in now can't. Not saying that everyone should become a monk, but just that a community kind of taking up some monastic practices or something, or thinking of their community in this sort of different frame might not be such a bad thing. Anyways, given all of that conversation that we've had in the past, we decided that this week we'd maybe dive into some of that thinking a bit more. And we're doing it by reading a kind of peculiar article written by two economists, so it's not that far off the beaten track for us. The article is called "The Byzantine Monastery as a Commons." Very interesting. It's an economics article that's kind of thinking about the monastery as an institution that manages commons and like what are the qualities of a good commons managing institution. So, anyways. That's a very bizarre introduction to this episode, but I think it's a compelling one. People say that degrowth requires a type of monastic type of life, but what if that's actually helpful? This is maybe the pitch here.
Yeah, that's right. The criticism comes from people who are reading degrowth in bad faith, and what they mean by saying it is a degrowth, or saying that it's a monastic thing is to say it's something focused on kind of like austerity and not having cool stuff and being okay with a shitty life. That's basically what it comes down to. That's the criticism, that if you do degrowth, well, I'll have to live a monastic life, which is to say one where you eat like gruel and you only get to go out of your cell a few times a day, and I don't know, whatever stereotypes people have of monasteries, some of which I'm sure are true of certain monasteries, but not necessarily true of monasticism at large. And what I think is really interesting about that is that degrowth people sometimes also give into that same criticism. They're like, we promise, it's not monasticism, trust us. We don't want to be monks. It's bad for everybody. We're not advocating for that. And I guess the conceit of the episode here is to say, well, what if you were, though? What if you were advocating for monasticism, but of a certain kind? And I feel like when we discovered this idea as we were writing the book, the criticism, we had a bit of a talk to be like, should we or shouldn't we kind of lean into rehabilitating the word monasticism and asceticism for degrowth? And I think at first I was of two minds about it. I was like, I don't know, it feels like it's more trouble than it's worth. It's just confusing. Degrowth is already a confusing word. Are we also going to add some other confusing words to the whole big yucky stew? And now I'm for it. I'm so for it. I've become a big monastic degrowth proponent, but in a certain way. And I guess what's cool about this conversation is the book is done. We're not allowed to change it anymore. So the conversation here is maybe like pushing that thought in a further direction. So maybe down the road, we'll be able to say more about it, but good to have an excuse to talk it through.
People should consider words more deeply and types of spiritual practices more deeply before they just write them off as and give in to the criticism that is made using them. Okay, so we're going to talk about Byzantine monks and commons and institutions and what it takes to manage all those things. I think it's cool for a lot of different reasons to actually use this lens as a way to start thinking about degrowth and about socialism more broadly. Because in the degrowth literature, take, I don't know, Jason Hickel, for example, people will often talk about the commons and how we need to sort of decommodify capitalism. The privatization of life is something that kind of robs everybody of the material goods they need to live, and that if we decommodify things and treat them, more as a commons than a private good, that we'd be better off. It would boost the well-being of populations, and that is cool and true. And we'll talk more about the way that degrowth handles that in a minute. But the thing is that those are macroeconomic ideas, and the thing that we're talking about in this episode that's kind of cool is the ways that institutions, what are the qualities of an institution to manage a commons effectively and efficiently and in a way that is mindful of democracy and other things. So it's easy and common for socialists, whether they're degrowth socialists or not, to be interested in the idea of a commons, but rarely are people thinking about what kind of community do you need to actually manage those types of things? And that is something you get in this article that we're talking about today. So kind of neat.
Very neat, I would say. Let's get into it. And maybe as we go, we can talk more too about what it would mean to port some of that stuff over into our own time, and some of the weird stuff around monasticism and attempts to revive monasticism. I feel like there's kind of a lot going on in my brain around that, but I'm going to try to hold off. I'm just thinking as a preview, I guess, about things like neo-monasticism and the weird world of evangelical anarchism in the early 2000s, and Rod Dreher talking about a new Saint Benedict and all these kinds of weird things happening. But we'll get there at the end, I think. But I think that you're right, Matt, first of all, to kind of say, well, we should probably have an idea of what the commons even refers to. And I feel like that term is a complicated one. On the one hand, it seems very simple. The commons is stuff that is common, should be common. But I feel like also exactly how things stop being common and for what purpose and so on. Once you start asking those questions, you inevitably get drawn into conversations about capitalism and how capitalism kind of stops things from being common. And also some stuff is easier to make less common than other stuff. So I don't know, Matt, maybe you can start us out here. What even is the commons?
Yeah. There's, a lot of ways to parse exactly this question out, but the article that we are reading, by the way, written by Paskalis Arvantidis, an economist from the University of Thessaly in Greece. I don't know anything about this person, but they wrote a neat article that kind of caught my attention, so thank you for this article, I guess. Strange academic. I'm sure you're a great guy. Who knows? Not. I don't know them, and I'm not endorsing them, but they did write this one article, and I do like it. Anyways, in the article themselves, they define the commons in a few different ways. They say broadly that the commons are governance regimes developed by communities for the management of common goods. You can tell that they're economists, and, probably better off for it. And the commons are, in essence, institutions of collective action that emerge from the bottom up, aiming for sustainable utilization and exploitation of collective goods, the strengthening of the community, and the welfare of its members. Okay, so yeah, more or less what you just said, Dean. It's the things that are common, and the things that are common are good for everybody. So we have to kind of be mindful with the way that they are managed and used. He cites a whole bunch of other people. Obviously, as an economist who's thinking about those things, there are a lot of other economists like him who are thinking about the commons and what they are and how they exist in the world. So a few other examples that he kind of goes through, citing the literature, are that commons are a gift of nature or common goods of humankind that need to be protected. Commons are community organized systems for sustainable management of shared resources. Commons are a new collective peer-based mode of production in which peers collaborate in a self-organized network. They are a transformative social process by which communities build new social relationships and values to defend common good and to move beyond capitalism. And also, commons are complex socio-political economic institutions for a community self-governance alternative to market-based and state-based systems of governance. All of these are kind of interesting characteristics or ways to sort of define what exactly we're talking about. The thing that I do find quite interesting, and it's maybe worth just kind of putting a little pin in on our big serial killer corkboard of commons stuff at the moment, is the idea that the commons are, they're about community self-government. they're sort of institutional, right? That there are institutions in a community that are there to administrate the commons. But those institutions are not always the same as a state-based, approach to those institutions. They could be, there could be overlap or something, but especially as we'll see with the Byzantine monastery kind of situation in the Byzantine Empire, which is a very specific historical outgrowth of that. The monastery exists in as like a complement to the state. The state empowers it to exist in the Byzantine economy, something that we've seen in other socialist experiments like in Venezuela and things, for better and for worse, I'd say. But interesting though that the question of the way that the common managing institution and how it exists with distinction to the state is kind of always up in the air to be negotiated. So something to keep in mind as we're kind of working through some of these ideas.
A quick side note, you just compared the Byzantine commune state dialogue to the Venezuelan state commune dialogue, which I would never have done in a million years, but is actually very fun. And now I'm imagining the Bolivarian Byzantine Revolution and somebody out there. There's definitely a Twitter account that is that brand, and I'm sad I haven't found it yet, but it's a great idea.
Yeah, maybe it's a hot take or something. I don't know, but it is like it's strikingly similar. The Byzantine Empire, they liked the monasteries. They were good. They were good for business. They were a good way to manage production and manage sort of resources in an area. And I don't know, man, they made space for them and they empowered them within the economy and like sometimes, relax taxes on them and all kinds of other stuff. But I mean, that's not dissimilar to the ways that Hugo Chavez kind of makes space for communes within, the Bolivarian state. I'm sure that there are important differences. I'm sure. Yeah. I'm sure there are. But there's more than one similarity, so that's saying something.
That is saying something. But the weird niche Twitter account is up for grabs, I guess. So someone can explore that. I feel like too, maybe this is also a preview, maybe I'm also getting ahead of ourselves, but there is something to be said about how communes relate to the state in different kind of contexts in different ways, including in the church. So the article does a lot of interesting stuff comparing the Eastern expression of monasteries and monastic life and the kind of dialogue with the state to Western monasteries and how they dialogue with the state and the church, I guess, as well. It's kind of a third actor. There's kind of three big actors there: the church, the monastery, and the state. And I guess without giving too much away, what is really fascinating about the Eastern expression is that there is a bit more relative autonomy and a kind of trust that the monasteries could probably figure things out without the intervention of the state. And the state is also kind of not interested in guiding that. I mean, to an extent, right? It's not like the monasteries are, radical agents who are also building like some kind of alternative society in the Byzantine Empire. That's not really happening. But as compared to the expression in Western monasteries, the church and state both added a lot more kind of pressure to the monastery and in fact often sort of created rent-seeking opportunities on monastic land in some really complicated ways, and that sort of grafted the monastery into the structure and also exploited the monastery some more. And that's kind of interesting too, to just sort of look at like the way that communes appear throughout history, the way that monasteries appear throughout history, the kind of dialogue with the state and so on. They sort of, they don't provide like one-to-one patterns or anything like that, but they provide like many different ways that a commune can both resist imperial projects and participate in imperial projects and kind of get wrapped up in it, which I guess I say as a way of being like, I think a lot of Christians, a certain kind of Christian, looks at monastic structures as like a kind of a way out of politics, like a way to forget about politics or I guess bet it all on the church. Like if you just sorted it out in the monastic community, then you'd be fine. You could kind of retreat into the safe island of monastic life. But what I like about articles like these is they show you that there's always this kind of complex interaction because the monastery is always part of the world, whether it wants to be or not. And that's a kind of interesting ongoing lesson for communes. And I think is maybe like a portable lesson. Like you can move that over to expressions of communes in Venezuela, but also in kind of resistance communes in capitalist societies like the Occupy movement or land defense and so on. So anyway, all that to say, it's just fun to think about how communes triangulate all these weird relationships: churches, states, economies, and so on.
Yeah, totally. The first of all, hang on, sorry. Let me say two things really quickly. The point you made a minute ago about the ways that there's sort of a type of autonomy in sort of the Byzantine like Cenobitic type of monastic experience is quite important, because that introduces like a type of democracy to that type of monastic life that does not exist in sort of like the Western framework. Very interesting. But that autonomy is also like always kind of up for grabs as well. So the article that this is all kind of stemming from is covering only like a kind of chunk of the Byzantine Empire, the history surrounding it. So the article says from 323 to 1453 is sort of the bookends of this consideration. And interestingly enough, the Byzantine monastic sort of system, if that's what you'd call it, it ends up getting taken over by the church as sort of like the governing body of it in the Council of Chalcedon in like 450 whatever. So for at the very beginning, there's a lot more space for autonomy in these types of communities, but later on the church has more of a governing role in them, but doesn't mean that it sort of squashes the autonomy of them altogether. It just kind of changes some parts of the equation. The other thing I wanted to say, sorry, is as I was reading this article, I was getting the same vibe from when we got really into pirates that one summer. I think that was like the summer when it was like maybe in 2020 and COVID was on the rise, but we got really, really into pirates for kind of like for a very similar reason, that because like piracy seems like a funny thing. We love Jack Sparrow, this guy in the Black Pearl, he's doing his great thing. But when you look at sort of like the history of pirates and sort of the structures by which they had to operate, you found like a very democratic sort of like proto workers movement on the high seas. A type of weird socialism and anarchism out there that like was not called that, but it was just being a pirate. And I feel like there is a very similar vibe in this type of like Byzantine monastic community, where like for a hot second people discovered something kind of radical and like they kind of just did it, but it wasn't framed as sort of politics because of the context that it was within. But anyways, it gives me the same kind of idea where it's like this is something very cool is happening here, and because of the religious background and nature of it, you wouldn't pick up on it as being very cool until you kind of take a closer look.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, it reminds me. Okay, we're gonna get back to the commons in a second, which we're supposed to talk about more of. But it reminds me of this neat collection of sayings of the Desert Fathers by Thomas Merton, where he kind of like just curated a handful of sayings. And in the introduction to it, I mean, I probably read this like years and years ago, so I have no idea what how accurate this quote is. But he observes that the Desert Fathers were kind of weird forms of proto-anarchists. Like they went out into the desert right when the empire is starting to congeal. So Christianity becomes the law of the city in a certain way, becomes the imperial norm. And so the response to that by a handful of Christians is to be like, I'm out of here. I got to go to the desert. There's no way I'm going to be a Christian in here. It's not going to work. And there's something really interesting about that as well. Like Merton's probably wrong in a certain way, although he knows that to be like, like, I guess what I'm saying is he's intentionally being like, I don't know, silly. Like he's intentionally kind of blurring the boundaries by being like, this is a kind of anarchist move. It's not exactly an anarchist move, but it is a kind of like rejection of an imperial expression of Christianity in a pretty radical way. And given that desert experiment is also an important kind of laboratory for what will become the monastic experiment later on, I think you see that a lot in Christianity, that there's this like tendency where even as Christianity gathers power and like congeals and consolidates power, it also is like constantly subverting itself in all these weird ways by like rejecting that path, so that there's never really like one clean hegemonic Christian story. There's always like a internally confused and internally like at odds contradictory story within Christianity. So all that to say, I don't know. It's true that Christianity, the majority of it has done the imperial part, and probably couldn't be otherwise, but it's never done that without protest or difference, and monasticism is one of those kind of expressions.
Yeah, cool. All right, so hopefully we've got everybody like excited to learn about monasticism. But before we do, let's make sure this is tied into the larger conversation about degrowth that we've been having. There's so like I don't know. I made the joke a minute ago about the serial killer corkboard, but I swear this is like exactly what we have built here. Just like push pins and strings and note cards. One says degrowth, one says pirates, one says monasticism.
There's definitely a huge bone church in the middle of it with a big question mark. We haven't figured out how to put that in there, but it'll find its way.
We're gonna figure it out one day. Anyways, for now though, let's like really quickly talk about the commons as it matters to sort of like the contemporary conversation in socialism and in degrowth. Man, it's just dawning on me that the last monthly review is about this, but we don't have any notes about that. So maybe next week, or maybe not. Who knows? Depends on how we're feeling. But anyways, within the conversation of degrowth, the commons come up quite a bit because implicit within degrowth, or at least in a lot of the literature surrounding in degrowth, it's antagonistic to capitalism. Capitalists, they foreclose on every public good, and they find increasingly creative ways to extract profits and economic growth by charging us for those public goods. So, like education, healthcare, access to particular types of land, outdoor spaces, like your community pool, housing in general, all of these things are things that are common goods. Everyone needs these things to survive. They exist out in the world, and then capitalists find ways to scheme and get money from you and into their pockets, so that not only are they making money, but the economy is growing and everything is great, right? That's the conceit of capitalism. But that is a bad system because we need all those things. It's bad for everybody. This system that I've described is not good. The privatization of things that are necessary for our lives are a net negative on the overall well-being of a population because it means that like people can't have them, or they have to struggle incredibly hard to get them, like school, education, healthcare, or a friggin' apartment. I don't know. It's hard to get all of these things. To have enough money to get them is, you have to sell the better part of your day so that you can do it. So the answer in the degrowth literature is finding ways to reclaim the commons and decommodify all of that kind of stuff. Put it back into the hands of the public is a key component of degrowth and socialist movements. This is what this is the sick future the left wants, is for you to have a nice apartment. In Jason Nichols' book Less is More, he says capitalists enclose commons or public wealth in order to generate growth, forcing people to work more simply to pay for access to resources they once enjoyed for free. As we create a post-growth economy, we can flip this equation around. We can choose to restore a commons or create a new commons in order to render ever-rising incomes unnecessary. The commons becomes an antidote to the growth imperative. And that's awesome. And this is like a systemic critique that I think is extremely important. To get that kind of stuff done, you need a state that can make, laws and policies that can say you can't charge people that much money for rent. You can't charge people for healthcare. You can't charge people for school. That is important. But putting things back into the public hands is good at an infrastructural level. But you need like institutions that are strong and democratic and that have a particular set of qualities that can actually govern those common goods so that everyone can use them and that nobody exploits them. So that being the case, some economists, like the people who've authored this article, think that studying historical commons is a really, really good idea. That's like the most like anti-intellectual way I can say it. It's a really good idea to think about those things. And interestingly enough, economists often will study like contemporary commons, all kinds of like co-ops and and other types of like commons, or like housing co-ops and work co-ops and all kinds of things like that. Some of them are more or less political, and some of them are like explicitly sort of left-wing projects and so on. But sometimes really interesting examples like monastic life are things that kind of get ignored because, I don't know, they're weird. No one's ever thought about that before. So this article is kind of trying to fill that gap in the knowledge, and explain why we should maybe think about historical forms of common management, as well as more contemporary ones.
Yeah, and I think there's kind of a interesting ongoing discussion about that on the left as well. One person who really put the commons discussion in the front of economics in a big way is a woman named now that I started trying to say what her name is, I forgot it. Eleanor Ostrom. She won the Nobel Prize for economics for talking about the commons and kind of analyzing the commons, and I guess like having the having the incredibly original economics idea that, like, I don't know, maybe commons are important and we shouldn't just destroy them. I mean, other people have talked about it as well, but she sort of made it like a big conversation in contemporary economics. And there are a handful of other left-wing people who talk about it as well. But in Ostrom's work in particular, she's kind of an interesting person because she's very insistent on the utility of the commons and the fact that that commons can be managed effectively. And she provides practical examples and all that kind of stuff. But she's not really she's a progressive person. She's not trying to, though, say like, and that's why capitalism is like the problem here that needs to be solved. She maybe, I think her work can like move in that direction if you want it to, but she's not going to do it for you. And a lot of Marxists have kind of taken up the language of the commons and then pushed it in like a more radical direction. And just to maybe underscore like how diverging paths can come out of that commons conversation. Even like the World Bank and other international finance institutions have started talking about the commons as being very important. And nevertheless, those institutions are like constantly trying to privatize them and destroy them. And so there's like kind of a capitalist way of appropriating that conversation, which is to say it's not like an automatic left-wing position. But you also have people like Silvia Federici, the feminist Marxist that we talk about on here every once in a while. She like directly goes in on the World Bank and tries to sort of talk through other forms of commons paradigms or commons analysis. And that's all very impressive, really fascinating. David Harvey has also done a ton of stuff on the commons. So there's like a left-wing version of this and then maybe a neoliberalized version of it. And all that to say, it's like something you really got to be a bit suspicious of, and at the same time understand that putting the commons in front of economists is a really fascinating move, because it like forces economists to realize that sometimes the best solution to something is actually not, cutting it up and privatizing it and making it illegal for the public to access it, as though that was like a good idea.
Yeah, right. Michael Hart and Antonio Negri also have the book Commonwealth, which is
Right.
a big exploration of the commons, and I'm just gonna say the name. I'm just putting it out there. You can read it yourself and you can figure it out. But it's in the big trilogy of books that they wrote. It's the one that comes after Empire, so you can dig into that if you feel so led by the spirit. But like you're saying, Dean, it is really interesting to see the ways that economists kind of like either I don't know, react to the idea of the commons, or like what is the answer to the commons? Is it privatization, or is it communal management, or something else? And a lot of this conversation stems from a 1968 article by a guy named Garrett Hardin, who wrote something called Tragedy of the Commons. This is maybe a phrase that you've probably heard it. People kind of throw it around. It's sort of very popular. He was kind of, interestingly enough, interested in environment and economics, but he was writing in the late 1960s, where everyone was extremely concerned with overpopulation. So a field of inquiry fraught with all kinds of pitfalls that I think you should be very wary of. especially around racism and sort of a type of disdain for people in the global south. But anyways, in the Tragedy of the Commons, he sets up like I think what is the basic problem of the commons, but also like has a very stunted understanding of maybe like what is possible with managing something collectively. So, but it's important to kind of get on the table just because like this is like the foil that will always be kind of wielded against sort of leftist attempts to kind of think through collective management or a more democratic management of the commons. But imagine that you share a pond in common with a group of people, and the pond is an important resource for your community in general because everyone needs to drink water and everyone likes the pond. The pond is great, in case you didn't know. But you aren't like all those dumb people that like to drink water from the pond. You have the kind of grind set necessary to thrive in this capitalist world. You need the water from the pond, but you don't need to drink it because you drink bottled water. You need it for your business to create Funko Pops. You're a Funko Pop salesman, a Funko Pop creator, a Funko Pop designer. And because the pond is held in common, you can more or less exploit the water for your own benefit. So you can use some of the water to create the Funko Pops. I mean, I'm sure the Funko Pops need water to survive, to be produced. But you know, if some Funko Pop sludge seeps out of the factory and into the pond, I mean, who cares, right? It belongs to everybody. So it's hurting everybody. The sort of blame is not directly on your shoulders. Anyone could have put the Funko Pop slime in the pond. We gotta find the guy who did this, you know, that sort of situation. Because the pond's held in common, so any degradation or like long-term costs from your overuse or your exploitation is really borne out by the rest of the community. And if you're a bottled water drinker, maybe it doesn't really affect you. Maybe you live further away from the pond, so you don't really give a shit about this. This is the tragedy of the commons, is because it's sort of because if a resource is held in common, there's always this chance that somebody could overexploit it and maybe even destroy it. But the cost is borne out by everybody else in the community. So even if you are like a good steward of the pond, you know, it doesn't matter because there's one person that could come in and still kind of destroy it for everybody. That's the tragedy of the commons, right? And fine, like that is a real problem to consider, but people use the tragedy of the commons like that's the last straw and socialism is over. But I feel like that's just like giving up too easily, and it forecloses upon the possibilities that communities can reach consensus together to care for the environment they live in. And that seems to me like not a hard idea to imagine because I've seen communities do that. I don't know. It's just like people care about the place they live oftentimes. So anyways, studying how communities can manage resources collectively is pretty interesting and important because you got to figure out how to make sure that one Funko Pop guy doesn't ruin it for the rest of us.
There's a really interesting example where here in Ontario, Nestle had been bottling water in Ontario by just like draining tons and tons of water out of a lake for basically free. Like the city didn't really charge them for using it. So they're essentially just like making money out of nothing, which is nuts. And it is, I mean, when you start looking up like how much money they make and how much money they pay for use of that resource, it's absolutely mind-boggling. And interestingly enough, like there has been a lot of civil society pressure on it. Eventually Nestle left and now there's like another company trying to buy the plant, which is also all really fascinating stuff. But the Catholic Church, interestingly, decided to really get involved in that struggle. And the Diocese of Hamilton, Ontario, ended up banning all bottled water in the entire diocese. So you're just like not allowed to have it. And it was like because this one priest was so mad about it, just like really pissed off. And the water taking like affected a lot of local farmers and his own parishioners and so on. And it's really fascinating because like in my experience, Canadian Catholicism, you know, like it can activate around a lot of things, but it doesn't usually activate like en masse like that. Like you get like a parish here or a priest there, a bishop here and there who are like really passionate about an issue, but to like mobilize a whole diocese like that is really different. But anyway, it's a really cool example of like when a faith community also wants to protect the commons and kind of recognizes maybe the tragedy of it when a rich company is just like pulling it all out of your backyard.
Yeah, that is very cool to hear. A great anecdote, a good thing to add into the mix here. What's so funny, I mean, what that example highlights and what is often so funny about these like tragedy of the commons types of scenarios is that it's like, well, okay, there's a pond, everybody has access to it, everyone can use it, and like, oh man, someone's exploiting it. And now we all have to suffer the consequences because one person exploited it. And that's true. That is a problem. But it's like, it's not like we can't figure out who's doing the exploiting, right? Like when there's a company like Nestle and they're like draining water from from one of the lakes, it's like, I wonder who's doing it. I wonder who the problem here is. I wonder who we need to create a policy for around or something like that. I wonder who we have to chase out of our neighborhood. It's like, yeah, it's always going to be Nestle. It's always going to be, a big corporation. It's never just like some dude doing it. It's not just like one completely rational economic actor. It's a guy, who works for Nestle or something. Sorry. The Nestle slander is okay. So then the question then becomes like, what kinds of qualities do institutions need to have in order to govern common goods effectively, to sort of like get around this whole tragedy of the commons kind of situation? So the authors of our article give us 8 things to think about. I'm just going to read them out here really quickly, as fast as I possibly can. So number 1, there are clearly defined boundaries of the community involved whose membership, identity, and strategy are obvious to everybody. Cool. Commons arrangements are in line with the local socio-political and economic conditions, prescribing a fair and equitable share of benefits and costs. 3, rules and decisions are made by consensus through collective choice arrangements that allow participation. 4, monitoring by accountable monitors is essential, establishing low-cost, norm-abiding mechanisms. 5, transgressions are punished by using graduated low-cost socially enforced sanctions. 6, conflicts are addressed with low-cost and easy-to-access conflict resolution mechanisms that are perceived as fair by members of the community. 7, the right of the community to self-govern is recognized by higher-level authorities. And 8, the case of larger systems, governance is organized in multiple, appropriately coordinated layers of nested enterprises. So these are the 8 things, the 8 great things that you need to have so that you can govern the common goods effectively. An institution that can do all these things. Really interesting. And once you start thinking about monastic life within this frame, it does kind of all click into place. Especially the transgressions are punished by using graduated low-cost socially enforced sanctions. So it's like you did something wrong and now you can't come to prayer for a few days or something. Pretty good stuff.
Yeah. And maybe we should say those 8 points come from Ostrom, the economics person I talked about earlier, and some other scholars too. So it's like a kind of codified thing, which I think is also, some of the pieces have like whatever things you can like quibble with here and there, and I would like to, but anyway, just to note, I think, there are some general principles there that are really fascinating. And I guess the really fascinating thing about this article is that they're trying to port some of those categories onto monastic life and then filter monasteries through them to be like, are these actually effective communes in the way that these economists describe? And that is such a fun, hilarious experiment.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, for sure. Especially when we're talking about like a historical period that is very far removed from us. It does seem like a very playful idea. A great thing to imagine. Okay, so the authors of this article, they go through, those 8 points, and then they start talking about the Byzantine monastic system and the ways that it works sort of structurally and economically in the context of the society that it's within, the Byzantine Empire. And there's a lot of details, and I've obviously not put them all in the notes for this podcast because that would be insane. We have 20 minutes left to talk about this, so we can only get to some of it. Anyways, they write, one historic collective action institution is still alive. It's the Orthodox Christian monastic system that developed and thrived in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, Byzantium, enabling the monastic communities acting in their best interest to successfully manage multiple and diverse common goods for very long periods of time. It is such a funny description of the Orthodox Christian monastic system, calling it a collective active institution. Like, that is true factually, but man, I wouldn't have gotten there in 1,000 years unless somebody else had written this. Cool. So the Byzantine monastic system is a collective action institution that does manage common goods over a long period of time. It's great. They do so through a whole bunch of different mechanisms that you might be familiar with. There's a lot of like sort of religious jargon in this one, and maybe we can try to parse some of it out, and maybe some of it we probably can't. But like the main economic movers of this particular type of monastic system are monks. These monks in particular, though, are called cenobites. So cenobites are like a spiritual community that is monastic, living apart from society. So there's sort of a countercultural aspect to it. But cenobites in particular focus on community life. I think that's maybe the defining feature. Is there anything else that you can think of, Dean, or is that broadly correct? I think that's right.
I think that's it.
Okay, great. So Cenobites, though, different in the Byzantine monastic communities, different though than like more Western traditions like the Dominicans or the Franciscans or Benedictines or whatever. All of those are, not unrelated, but they have a different type of structure that is more hierarchical than the monastic system at play, especially during this particular time period, before the church kind of even takes hold of these communities as sort of a governing body. Cool. So yeah, there's the style of Cenobitic living is a style of like monastic life where monks lived, worked, worshipped together with resources held in common, and enjoyed considerable popularity and proliferation to become the common model in Byzantium. The article actually goes out of its way to explain that there were more than 1,000 of these communities, these like Byzantine monastic communities throughout the Byzantine Empire, which seems pretty considerable. Long-lasting communities who can manage production and governance of a whole bunch of things within Byzantine society. So these are all independent. They're all existing independently of the state, and I mean, more or less authorized by the state to do so. So that's a pretty interesting vibe to kind of take in and consider as like a organizational structure.
Yeah, and there's a lot kind of to say about how that structure kind of, I guess, shifts and flows, and they go through a history of kind of the monastic community management over time that I think is really fascinating, but trying to figure out like the diversity and what they call the flexibility of the structure is really fascinating. So they say in the West, there's a kind of tendency for monastic orders to have these rules that become the featured organizing principle of how monastic life works. And in the Eastern expression, there are guidelines and rules, but they're not really tied to like a like founding figure per se, except for the founder of the monastery. But even that is a bit loose. So basically, when somebody's going to found a monastery, they're like responsible for making sure that there are enough resources in one place and the territory is like sufficiently large and there's kind of like enough maybe like resources or funds to like get things going. But the goal is to kind of lay the foundation for the community to reproduce itself and to develop over time. And they also say there's kind of a range of democratic participation in all of that. They're not too romantic about it. They go out of their way to explain this is not like this is not an Occupy Wall Street, like this is what democracy looks like kind of community. There's an obvious hierarchical chain, and there's obviously lots of other things in terms of like the kind of gendered aspects of communities and so on. But what they say is there's a lot of diversity in terms of like how leadership is chosen. So for example, a leader might be chosen maybe on the one side of the spectrum by the kind of current abbot deciding from his students who's going to be the next abbot. That would be like the least democratic model, I guess, to the other side of the spectrum where the community itself votes on who their next abbot will be. And then within that, there's also, though, lots of other democratic participation pieces. So Many times the abbots are required to consult on big discussions or big decisions with a group of monks. And the point being, I guess, what's fascinating about the Eastern model is there's a real kind of grassroots flavor to it, or bottom up flavor to it, which I think is not the stereotype we have of monasteries, right? Like there's a sort of participatory aspect. And I mean, in my experience too, that also kind of finds its way into Western religious life today. But talking about medieval society, I don't know. I guess I just have to take their word for it. This is like more the vibe in Byzantine life than in kind of Western churches. But all that to say, what's really fascinating is the authors want to prove that point, the participatory point, because they also want to say the commune, by definition, or the kind of commons agent, like the group that's running the commons, also has to have sufficient kind of room for people to participate and make decisions together. And they're trying to prove that monasteries do that. And when it comes to the degrowth conversation, focused also on democracy and participation, there's some sort of interesting, like maybe historical precedents in monastic life that are kind of fun and suggestive that are brought out in this article.
Yeah. For example, the authors of this article are recognizing that there is like a tension, right? There is a type of like bottom up flavor to these things, like you're mentioning, but it's not like perfect democracy. It's not it's not occupying a park and doing the people's mic or whatever. But they do write this. In fact, monks were engaged in decision making, but through indirect ways and processes of internal democracy. An example is the case concerning the acceptance of the community's regulatory framework by its candidates. From the early years of the institution, the novices had to first go over and then embrace the rules and practices of the monastery of their choice. Furthermore, an important process of collective decision-making was the selection of leadership. As discussed, the election of the abbot was a substantial issue that required collective acceptance by the community members, and in many cases, he was directly elected by them. So, yeah, I mean, like, there is... like... There's not a perfect democracy here, but there is a level of democracy that maybe you wouldn't expect.
Right.
And I think that is, it's worth saying. And like that is a collective choice. Like everybody consents to a particular type of, way of being and working. That, by the way, does fall under one of the the one of the 8 great things that you need to have a good commons governing institution. That's number 3, that rules and decisions are made by consensus through collective choice arrangements. So not perfect, but like, I don't know, pretty good. But there's a lot of other things that they argue kind of fits into those 8 rules from Ostrom that we talked about earlier. For example, the one that seems like the most easy and like kind of silliest one actually is the very first principle about having well-defined boundaries where everybody knows like what their job is and like what their role is within the community. And like that seems so obvious for a monastic community because like obedience is like a pretty important piece of that puzzle. But I don't know. Good. Why not? That makes sense. Like, but I mean, think of like every weird leftist organizing space you've been in, where people are really interested in embracing a type of horizontalism, and then it's like, okay, what's my job in the cool in the cool cadre? And everyone's like, I don't know, man. You're gonna be you just hang out here with us, and we'll figure it out as we go. Like that sucks. That's not the kind of situation that you want. But anyways, all of this leads to a type of institution characterized by what the authors say, a diversity and flexibility, that makes it like a strong way to manage resources that, end up benefiting society across the board. The Byzantine Empire probably, owes a lot to these monastic communities that worked kind of in the background to provide all kinds of important services to people, producing goods for sure. Like that's important. They made things, but also like these monastic communities were the safeguarders of culture, of important ideas. Like, if there was a book, these were the guys that were going to be copying it down and making a new manuscript of it. So, there's all kinds of like really important and big ideas that monastic communities are, charged with in these communities. And, that's they've done it. They figured out the tragedy of the commons. What you need is this, these eight good steps, and these monks have got it kind of sorted out. But I guess that's not all, Dean. Do you want to talk about new monasticism for a minute before we round the show out?
Yeah, well, I guess to maybe close off that piece, like what's fascinating about the article, if you wanted to say that monasticism is bad, there are certainly parts of monasticism that I wouldn't want to port over. I'm not going to go join a monastery myself
No way.
for a variety of reasons. That's fine. But exactly what monasteries are and what they mean, I think, is also something that is easily lost in casual dismissals of what's going on there. And with kind of the association of monasteries as places of like scarcity or austerity or severity, like certainly they can be that, but they don't have to be that, or not always that, etc. And what is really fascinating is if you read the monastery as a form of a commune, it is interesting to be like, this is a group of people who have devoted themselves not only to a kind of like spiritual path, but also to a particular area, a particular land with resources and things that they have to manage and do. And that in itself is like an important thing to maybe think through and consider. Exactly how to do that is maybe where it gets more complicated. So I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, this made me think about just all the other kinds of ways people have tried to rehabilitate monasticism. So on the right, you have people like Rod Dreher and others talking about the need for a new Saint Benedict. Rod Dreher gets that by doing just a completely insane butchering interpretation of Alistair MacIntyre, who calls for a new Saint Benedict at the end of his book After Virtue, in a very different way. MacIntyre's a left-wing guy, but Rod Dreher is saying that we need a Benedict who can kind of like retreat away from the world into the purity of our monastic communities, and I don't know, forget about all the decadence out there or whatever. That's bizarre. And if that's what you mean by monasticism, then obviously no, that's bad. There's also, though, a kind of bizarre retrieval of monasticism that was popular when Matt and I were both in undergrad, which is called neo-monasticism at the time. And it was kind of like a diverse conversation, diverse set of voices, but it caught on, or maybe I'll just say where I encountered it was actually in evangelical conversations around how to kind of like interact with the world and commit yourself to the poor and to a different way of living that was countercultural to capitalism. And I mean, the big voices, the people who became big voices are people like Shane Claiborne and Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove and some others, which I think is like cool. The idea is that you like move to an area, a neighborhood that is like badly resourced or whatever, and your community, you decide to live in community together, and you commit yourself to figuring out what it means to kind of be a Christian in that space. And I think there's a lot of cool things about that experiment, that project. I wouldn't disparage it, but the kind of interesting thing about it is that it, on the one hand, is maybe a more engaged form of monasticism than the kind of thing you see in like the Byzantine thing, although maybe I shouldn't say that either, because there are some like urban monastic experiments that are pretty engaged. But anyway, it's like it's a monasticism that's not a retreat from the world. It's like a bet on community life that engages the world. But the challenge with neo-monasticism, to me at least, has always been that it kind of has a hard time squaring the extremely local project, which again is very good, like the local project of committing to a neighborhood, with the more systemic project of like, capitalism itself is very bad, and maybe there needs to be a whole reorganization of production and consumption in the world, which would be a more structural, systemic problem to sort out. So, these are ways of recovering monasticism, one that is very bad and one that is maybe cool, but kind of leaves some open questions. I think for me, the question is like, okay, if you were going to start drawing some lessons from monasticism for degrowth, what would that really look like in a way that is aware of that structural piece? And it kind of reminded me of, I think I probably referred to this in the last time we talked about it on the show, but St. John Chrysostom has this funny sermon on the book of Acts, in Acts 4, where they're talking about the biblical communist community, where he says that what we should really do in the ancient world, what they should do in their city, is to repeat the experiment of Acts to kind of share everything in common. And his sort of proof for it is to say, if you look at a monastery, that's what they're already doing. And people are not starving or dying or having like material scarcity problems. On the contrary, it seems like they're able to like do more with less. They're able to expand their capacity by living in common. And his argument is that they should just like make the whole city into a big monastery. That's what they ought to do. And I think that is like a really fun idea to explore in a Christian degrowth socialist model. Like, what if we took the principle of the monastery, which is that a group of people are responsible for living in a sustainable way with each other and, you know, the given boundaries of a particular territory. And that kind of principle becomes the organizing principle around also how we should build a participatory society, one that's tied to actual physical boundaries, one where, you know, people actually have to get to know each other, work together, etc. And I feel like there's probably something there. So all that to say, there's more than one way to think that monasticism is cool and should be revived, but maybe degrowth gives us a chance to revive it in a more intentionally kind of structural way and avoid either becoming like right-wing retreat people or, you know, too localized in one way or another.
Yeah, yeah. That's really cool. I think that's a good way to start thinking about that. When I was doing some of this research for this episode, and I don't know, I was doing my deep dive on monasticism, I did come across another article, and I won't even really mention it other than saying I don't like it. But it was it was trying to make the point that that monastic communities are sustainable in a really long-term way. But they were using the Western tradition of Benedictine monasteries, and I think that is to me like an uncontroversial statement that, like, you know, these are lasting communities, they last a long time. But something that the author of this article was pulling out that I didn't quite vibe with was that the reason that they work so well is because of the type of like transcendence that you get within Christianity. Um, and, you know, people are more willing to sort of fall in line and not leave a community because they recognize some type of like, you know, transcendent good beyond just doing the work that they're doing. That rubs me the wrong way in particular because I feel like you know, even in the big degrowth city monastery that we're talking about here, it doesn't feel like that the Christian ideas maybe are important and the forms are important and maybe that type of comportment is important, but it doesn't seem to me that like theism is even that a
For
lot
sure.
of like a big theological idea does not seem that important for these types of institutions, like or even if you wanted to say that, like, yeah, you do actually have to have some type of like transcendent idea about like what is good, true, and beautiful in the world or something, like that might be the case, but like, you know, your answer to what that is could be vastly different. Like it could just be that like you want to live in a good community and like that's it, you know, like I don't know. So I feel like there's also some ways that people might like overcorrect for this type of monastery language too that I think is unhelpful, where you have to have this a type of like piety or theological framework, and I think that's maybe heading in the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what you get in a more contemporary iteration of something like Venezuela, which is the experiment to be like, you know, you probably do need some kind of orienting principle. In Venezuela, it's a principle of socialism, which maybe I think it's like maybe a bit too lazy or neat to be like, well, that's the transcendent ideal that you have to make a commune work
Yeah.
or something. You know, I think that's not quite true.
No, because it's probably, I mean, like some people involved in those communes probably aren't socialists, and maybe
Exactly.
or they just don't really care about politics or whatever. They just want to, you know, make a new park in their neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing is like in a lot of cases, the commune is compelling because it's just like where you live. Like you want the place
Hmm.
where you live to be good and better and healthy and clean and safe and whatever. But I do think that there's something to being like the idea insofar as like a commune also has to be supported by, you know, the state in some respect or another. Um, the idea organizing the kind of state's response to the commune matters in a big way. So the capitalist state response to communes is usually to discipline them or like, get them in legal trouble or make life hard for them or whatever. It's like very hard to kick Nestle out of taking all your water. Whereas the idea of the Bolivarian state toward communes is to say, well, these are good things and they should be affirmed and resourced and kind of brought into governance in a particular way. And I think that is maybe the lesson. So it's not that you like recover, it's not that you turn the city into a monastery by saying like everybody should like, I don't know, pray and believe the one big abbot who is your mayor or whatever, but instead to be like, how do you kind of translate that principle that you, when you kind of share, things miraculously expand rather than, become more and more scarce. That things become more scarce the more you divide them up, and the more you kind of bring people together, the further things go. And insofar as the commune structure is a way of like kind of delivering on that insight that you get in the monastery, but in a more pluralistic and secular society, I think that's like a really fascinating historical link that can be made in degrowth conversations.
Thanks for listening to Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you support us there for $1 or more, you can get an invite to our cool behind the paywall Discord community where we're talking about video games this week, folks. We are, at least some of us, are deeply into the paint of this new Hollow Knight game, and we're really invested in it. And it's very hard and frustrating. And boy, you could talk about that too with us, though. If you just support us on Patreon and get over there, you can also get access to our early episodes whenever we have them, which is only sometimes. But sometimes is better than no times. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Logical Spoon. And we'll see you next week.
Get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night.